monument, you have the newly built World War II monument. If we were to overlay the Sephiroth on top of these points, you will find that the street layout of Washington, D.C. forms precisely the Sephiroth or the Kabbalah tree of life. The idea that the two kingdoms are going to be fused together is recorded for us right in the street layout of Washington, D.C. Now let's go down to the ground a little bit, and intermingled with all of these street layouts and these concentric circles and these corresponding lines, a lot of these places are marked. A lot of the buildings, a lot of the locations that we've seen already are marked with statuary. I mean, it just seems like Washington, D.C. has more statues than the Vatican. I mean, they've got statues of just about everybody famous in America. They've got them depicted somehow, some way in Washington, D.C. The interesting thing about this, and I'm not going to do a full representation of all these statues, but the interesting thing about several of these is that they seem to indicate the same principles that we've been seeing throughout this video. The fusion of opposites, a male figure, a female symbol, and then their offspring or their son representing the Antichrist or the divine man. The two kingdoms fused together. In the statue of James Buchanan, you have a male god on one side and a female statue on the other, with James Buchanan right in the middle of them. This represents Osiris, Isis, and Horus. The same principle that's behind the right-angled triangle you find exactly in this layout here. Now let's take a look at the Boy Scout Memorial, and I want to thank our good friends at Cutting Edge Ministries for providing some of this, number one, the background research, and number two, some of the footage that you're seeing here, because they've done a pretty good job, and I recommend their videos as sort of background into what we're looking at here, particularly the video called Riddles in Stone. But you see here the Boy Scout Memorial. Now the Boy Scouts were started by a man by the name of William Boyce, who was a 33rd degree Mason. The symbol for the Boy Scouts of America is the fleur-de-lis, which we now know is the symbol for three-strand DNA. In the Boy Scout Memorial in Washington, D.C., you find this theme present. Here you have a statue of a man, a statue of a woman, and a little Boy Scout seemingly as their offspring, forming the sacred triangle. Again, Osiris, Isis, and Horus, those two coming together to form the new offspring or the new man. We look at Lincoln Square. We mentioned it earlier, part of the Sephiroth formation. And here in Lincoln Square, you have a picture, of course, a statue of Abraham Lincoln, the male. You have a statue on the opposite end of a woman, here showing the fusion of the male and the female together. Other statues and memorials spread about through Washington, D.C. We have the Lincoln Memorial, which is a Greek temple. Now remember, a temple is a picture of the human body, and it has a statue of Abraham Lincoln inside of it, and he appears as a god inside of this temple. So here, get this imagery. We have a temple with a god inside of it as part of the statuary of the complex of Washington, D.C. Now, I've been to this particular location there, and you know what I do is I count things, and I had a friend with me, and we started from the reflection pool, which we'll talk about in a minute, walking up the steps to the Lincoln Memorial. It's exactly 46 steps up there. That's the exact number of chromosomes that we have where our DNA is stored. Then we move across the pond to Jefferson Memorial. This was designed after Jefferson's own design. The image of it is that of a Roman pantheon. A pantheon, the two words there, pan and theon, or which is basically theos, is the idea that this temple is a temple for all of the gods. That's why you have the word pan there. So a pantheon is a temple where all of the gods dwell. Here again, think about this. The temple being a picture of the human body, and it is the dwelling place of the gods. There's like another term for this. It's called demon possession. But here again in the Jefferson Memorial, we see the dwelling place of all the gods, or the fusion together of the gods in the human body joining together. That's an image of Daniel's fourth kingdom in Daniel chapter 2. Often around these monuments you see what's called a reflecting pool. Notice the imagery here, Washington's monument being reflected inside the pool. Now this is meant to be the concept of As above, so below. We talked about that concept in the last video. The phrase or the concept of as below basically is a concept showing the two kingdoms fusing together. The heavenly kingdom with the earthly realm being joined together. That's what that is at the heart of the reflecting pool. There is a pagan practice that corresponds with this called scrying. It is the practice of gazing into a mirror or gazing into a pool of water or sometimes a pool of mercury in order to make contact with the gods. That is the same principle that you have in the reflecting pool, as above, so below. Now, going along with this same concept of as above, so below, you remember we talked about in the last video how that Dan Brown had put into the story that the villain of the lost symbol, a person by the name of Moloch, which was the god of, killing your babies in the Old Testament. Anyway, this villain called Moloch had taken the grand master of the worshipful master of the House of the Temple Lodge in Washington, D.C., a guy named Peter Solomon. That's just a made-up name. Anyway, took and cut his hand off, and he made his hands make the symbol of as above, so below. He took this hand and he placed it right in the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The fingers were pointed up. Dan Brown makes this big deal about this. The fingers were pointing up to a mural that's on top of the Capitol dome in Washington, D.C. That mural happens to be called the Apotheosis of Washington. Now, here's an interesting thing about the phrase apotheosis. Remember, everything that we've seen before is that Freemasonry and the symbols of Freemasonry always point you to the divining of mankind, or making a mankind into a god. The phrase apotheosis means turning a man into a god. And so when you look at the mural of the apotheosis, you have George Washington now being deified after his death. This exact concept comes to us from Genesis chapter 3. We mentioned it earlier. This is what the serpent promised to Eve. For God doth know that in the day that ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So the very thing that the devil promised to Eve was that she, through partaking of this particular fruit, would become a god. This same concept is in the Mormon Church. And if you don't know a little bit about Mormon history, well, then I'll tell you that Joseph Smith and the early leaders of the Mormon Church all became Freemasons when they were in Nauvoo, Illinois. In fact, a lot of the rituals and symbols that are in the Mormon Church are clearly Masonic. But the Mormon Church teaches that man, when he dies, if he is a good Mormon and he has this Hieros-Gamos marriage, this sacred ritual with his wife, I mean, that goes back to the thing we saw about the pentagram. But anyway, if he has this sacred union with his wife, when they die, they will be married together, and they will become gods over their own planet. This is exactly the same lie that Lucifer promised to Eve in the Garden of Eden. And if you remember from earlier works that we've done in our video, DNA, Jesus Christ, DNA in the Holy Bible and the Mother of All Secrets, you will see that in Genesis chapter 3 in your King James Bible, the exact number of words that Lucifer spoke to Eve in the Garden of Eden was 46. That's the exact same number of chromosomes that you have where all of your DNA is stored. Getting back to this mural, the Apotheosis of Washington, you see here, we're going to flip it around a little bit so you can see that Washington is surrounded by 13 goddesses. Remember, that's Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. They're holding a banner that says E Pluribus Unum. Now, we sort of adopted that as the whole theme of our country. You know, all these people from all over the world coming into the United States of America. And all those sounds real good, but the real meaning of E Pluribus Unum, out of many, one, is this fusion of the two kingdoms that are opposite each other in Daniel chapter 2. That Daniel's fourth kingdom fusing themselves with the seed of men. Then we see George Washington there, robed as a god there, surrounded by his celestial virgins and all of these other gods that are surrounding him there. And I want you to notice that one hand is extended upward, one hand is extended downward and outward. Now, Now, what a lot of people don't know is that at one time, there was commissioned a statue of George Washington that was supposed to sit right underneath this mural in the Capitol of Washington, D.C. It again followed that theme of the apotheosis of George Washington. And here he is, this statue, which was moved because some people thought it was indecent to have a president of the United States cloaked in a robe, half naked. But here you see George Washington making the same hand gestures, as above, so below. So the symbolism here of a statue of George Washington on the floor of the rotunda, and then the mural of George Washington up in the sky, was meant to symbolize as above, so below. But a more curious element of the gestures that Washington is making, both in this statue and in the mural in the rotunda, is that they mirror exactly the image of the god of the Knights Templar called Baphomet. Baphomet is the fusion of opposites. He is male and female together. He is part man and part beast together. He is light and darkness fused together. One hand points up, one hand points down. And you see there the symbol. He has male and female parts on his body. And you see, of course, also there the symbol of DNA. Now let's look outside of the Capitol building. The Capitol of the United States of America is probably one of the most recognized symbols, not only in this country, but in the entire world. A lot of times you'll be watching newscasts, and when they're doing a story about politics in Washington, generally they will show you an image of some kind of the Capitol building of Washington, D.C. Most people don't know the nature of why this building was designed the way it was. We've already seen with Lincoln's Memorial and Jefferson's Memorial that they were modeled after early temples. Well, the Capitol building is no different. The Capitol building, or at least the top part that you see there with the columns, that was designed to represent the temple of the goddess Vesta. The Temple of Vesta was the home of, you've probably heard of, the Vestal Virgins. They were the forerunners of nuns in the Roman Catholic Church. The goddess Vesta was the goddess of the hearth and fire. Now, something that you don't see, and I caught on to this when I was doing the research for this, is that I noticed that in most renditions of the Temple of Vesta, they were pretty much most noted by the circular structure, and especially the columns or the pillars that supported it. What we see in the Capitol building, however, is slightly different. We see not only the circular structure of the outer part of the building, but we see a massive dome sitting on top of it. That dome, according to Manly Hall, represents the human skull. He says the exact science of human regeneration is the lost key of masonry. For when the spirit fire is lifted up through the 33 degrees or segments of the spinal column and enters into the domed chamber of the human skull. So Manly Hall reveals that the domed chamber on the top of the Capitol building represents the human skull. Remember from the last video, we found out that the skull is a symbol or an emblem of the Antichrist. So I want you to get this imagery. Here again, once again, we're seeing the fusion of the opposites. We have the columns, the 72 columns that go around the top of the Capitol building. That represents the temple of the goddess, Vesta, the female. We have the domed skull on top of it. That represents the male, or Osiris, as it were, the sun god. Those of them fused together into one temple or one building that is the Capitol. Here again, this exact imagery is seen in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. One of our traditions that we have in this country is that when a president dies and is laid to rest, he is generally taken to, here again, we follow the sequence here. In the case of John F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's body was taken first to the White House, then it traveled that sacred path of Pennsylvania Avenue. Remember, the hypotenuse of the right-angled triangle representing the divine man. Kennedy's body was taken down Pennsylvania Avenue, taken to the Capitol to sit in the rotunda directly underneath the apotheosis of George Washington. The symbolism here is obvious. Here we have the body of a dead president or a dead person that there is hopes that he will live again. This is a picture of the Antichrist who is in the pit